I used to think my life was exactly what a man could hope for. I had a steady job in finance, a good marriage to a woman I trusted, and two grown kids, Jake and Emily, who I'd always been close to. My wife, Laura, and I had been married for 24 years, long enough to think we knew everything about each other. We had built a life on routine and trust. Family dinners every Sunday, annual vacations with the kids, birthdays spent together no matter what. Life was solid. Predictable. Maybe too predictable. Because when things started to shift, it wasn't in some dramatic movie-like way. No, it happened in those small, almost invisible moments that you could easily dismiss if you weren't paying attention. And for a while I tried to brush it all off. Laura would come home late, and I told myself she must be taking on extra work. She started being secretive about her phone, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to think anything was wrong. Then, one evening, I looked up from the bills I was paying to find her sitting across the room, staring off into space. I realized that I couldn't remember the last time she had smiled when I walked in the door, or the last time she'd asked me about my day. I could see it in her eyes, like there was a part of her I no longer knew. And it wasn't just me. Our kids noticed too. Jake asked me one day if his mom was all right, and I didn't know what to say. But the final crack came when I stumbled across something, a piece of evidence that shattered the stable life I thought we had. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make my heart stop. And that's when I knew everything I'd believed about us, all those years of trust and shared routines, had been built on sand. This is the story of how I uncovered the truth, piece by piece. And let me tell you, it's not what I thought it would be. I tried to push those doubts aside at first. Laura was my wife, after all. For nearly a quarter century, I believed in her, in us. She'd always been dependable, a steadying force in my life. We weren't exactly the romantic types, not anymore, but we'd built a life together that felt secure. When I look back on all those years, I could recall the little things. The morning coffee she'd bring me on weekends, the way she would stay up with me through long nights when work was hard. It all felt so solid. That's why it was so strange when these little things started to disappear. It began subtly. Her missing our nightly goodnight ritual, something she'd never skipped in all our years together. Then came the changes in her appearance. She'd always dressed simply, but suddenly, she was wearing new outfits, choosing expensive perfumes that were out of character, even for special occasions. I'd compliment her, and she'd brush it off, saying she wanted a little change, or that she was dressing for meetings at work. It didn't stop there. Laura started working later and later. At first, it was just once a week, but it soon became routine. Another late meeting, she'd say as she rushed out the door. There was always an excuse: big projects, demanding clients, pressure from her boss. I figured it was just a stressful time for her. She worked in project management, which I knew could be demanding. But the late nights became early mornings, too. I'd wake up to find her sneaking out of the bedroom at dawn. Once, I asked her why she was leaving so early. She looked at me, almost surprised, and mumbled something about getting a head start. She hadn't even looked me in the eye when she said it. I found myself lying awake after she left, wondering when our life had become so full of secrets. Then there was her phone. Laura had never been one to cling to her phone. In fact, she'd once forgotten it at home for an entire day and hadn't cared. But now, her phone was always nearby, even when she went to the bathroom or to bed. She'd angle it away from me when she texted and became almost skittish when I'd glance at it. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, her phone buzzed on the counter. Out of habit, I glanced over, but she snatched it up so quickly that the words on the screen were just a blur. She excused herself and headed upstairs, claiming she had work to do. I found myself staring at the empty staircase, feeling a knot in my stomach I hadn't felt since I was a young man, wondering if there was something I was missing, some glaring sign right in front of me. That gnawing feeling kept me up at night. I tried to focus on work, hoping it was just stress, but whenever I thought I'd managed to shrug it off, something else would crop up. A missed call that she couldn't explain, or a new outfit that didn't seem like her. It was like trying to put a puzzle together in the dark, each piece only deepening my confusion. One evening, after she'd left for another late meeting, I was gathering the laundry when I found something strange in her jacket pocket, a ticket stub. It was from a nearby theater, and the date was for last Friday, the night she'd told me she was staying late at work. I held that little slip of paper in my hand, feeling like the walls were closing in. I'd been so sure of her, and now it felt like I was grasping at smoke. For a few minutes, I sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at that ticket, wondering what to do. Should I confront her? Should I wait? I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, with one foot in the life we'd built, and the other dangling over a drop I couldn't see the bottom of. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. So I decided to keep quiet just for a little while longer and keep my eyes open. The days that followed felt like a blur. Laura's absences became more frequent, and the excuses seemed thinner. She'd say she was working, but then she'd come home looking distracted, flushed, even excited. When I asked her about her day, she'd give vague answers, as if she couldn't quite remember what had happened. And her phone, always that phone, would buzz with messages, lighting up her face with a look I hadn't seen in years. One night, I decided to stay up and wait for her. She called earlier, saying she'd be home late, as usual. I sat in the dark, watching the clock tick past midnight. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing hour, the doubt grew stronger. I tried to picture where she was, who she might be with, but my mind couldn't hold on to any single thought. Every possibility felt as impossible as it was horrifying. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I heard her car pull up. She walked in, looking startled to see me awake, but she recovered quickly. "You didn't have to wait up," she said, her voice just a little too casual. I tried to read her face, to find some flicker of guilt or regret, but she just smiled and headed to the bedroom without another word. I followed her, watching her peel off her coat, her earrings, her necklace, jewelry I hadn't seen before. She caught me looking and muttered, "Just a little treat for myself," before she turned off the light. I lay there beside her, staring at the ceiling, feeling the space between us widen like a chasm. I knew something was wrong, and yet I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, that she was just going through a phase, that maybe we'd grown too comfortable and she was simply trying to find herself. But the excuses were wearing thin, and so was my patience. A few nights later, after she'd left for another meeting, I found myself pacing around the house. I walked through each room, remembering all the years we'd spent here, all the laughter and arguments and quiet moments. And I realized that none of it felt real anymore. It was like looking at a stranger's life. I stopped by the window, staring out into the night, and I knew that I couldn't keep pretending. I needed to know. I needed proof, even if it shattered what little I had left. And so, I waited, and I watched. And in the days that followed, I began to notice patterns I'd never seen before, little routines that didn't add up. I made mental notes, observing each time she left the house, each excuse she gave, each strange look she gave her phone. It wasn't until the following week that I stumbled across the one thing that left no room for doubt. It was an ordinary afternoon, and I was gathering our things to take to the cleaners. As I picked up her coat, something heavy fell from the pocket and landed with a soft thud on the floor. I looked down and saw it, a crumpled hotel receipt, dated just last week, with her name on it. The name of the hotel was one I knew well, a local spot just a few miles away, where people often booked rooms for privacy. I stood there, holding that piece of paper, feeling like the world had stopped. There was no way to explain this, no excuse that could erase what I was looking at. This was it. This was the proof I'd been dreading, and yet it was exactly what I needed. My mind was racing, a storm of anger, hurt, and betrayal twisting inside me. But as I took a deep breath, I felt something else, a strange, cold clarity. I realized that I'd reached a point of no return. There was no saving this, no way to go back to the life we'd had before. And that's when I decided that I wouldn't confront her, not yet. Not until I had a plan, a way to make her see exactly what she'd done. I folded the receipt carefully, slipping it into my pocket, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. This was no longer about just finding the truth. This was about justice, about making her understand the cost of her betrayal. And that's exactly what I planned to do. In the days after finding that hotel receipt, everything about my life felt surreal. I'd go through the motions, making breakfast, heading to work, coming home to an empty house most nights, knowing full well that nothing was what it seemed. Every time Laura looked at me or kissed me goodbye, I felt the weight of that crumpled receipt in my pocket like a hot iron, burning through any remaining trust one had. But I held it together. I knew that confronting her would only bring a flood of excuses and half-truths. No, this was something I needed to handle with the same precision and patience I'd used in finance all these years. She'd lied to me, hidden things from me, betrayed everything we'd built. I wanted to respond with cold, calculated action. So, I took my first step. I started keeping track. Every time she left, every time she came home late or said she was working, I noted it. I kept these notes hidden, tucked away in my home office, where she'd never find them. The more I observed, the more it confirmed what I already knew. She was hiding something. And now, I was determined to find out exactly what. One evening, after she left for another late meeting, I slipped into our bedroom and started looking through her things. I'm not proud of it, but at that point, I felt I had no other choice. I opened her drawers, searched her purses, checked her desk. And that's when I found her phone, bill tucked away at the back of a drawer. As I scanned through the calls, one number stood out. It appeared again and again, sometimes at odd hours, other times multiple times in a row. It wasn't a number I recognized, and it wasn't a client or a friend that I knew of. The calls were frequent, often around the same time she claimed to be working. I jotted the number down, feeling a mix of disgust and determination wash over me. Here was more proof that I wasn't imagining things. She was talking to someone regularly, someone she didn't want me to know about. The following weekend, she mentioned she'd be spending the day with a friend, another convenient plan she had never shared with me before. After she left, I decided it was time to take things further. I drove to a local cafe and, after some deliberation, called the unfamiliar number. It rang a few times before a man's voice answered. He sounded young, confident, unbothered. "Hello." I froze for a moment, hearing the voice of a man who, for all I knew, had taken everything I held dear. I didn't say a word. I just listened to his breathing on the other end of the line. After a long, tense silence, I hung up, feeling a strange, cold satisfaction in knowing I had at least glimpsed the person who might be at the root of my unraveling life. But that wasn't enough. I needed something solid, undeniable proof that would show her the depth of her betrayal. It was time to turn to more drastic measures, something I never thought I'd resort to. The next day, I reached out to an old acquaintance, Tom, who had some experience as a private investigator. We'd worked together on a financial case years back, and I knew he'd be discreet. I didn't give him many details, just enough to let him know that I needed information on Laura's whereabouts and activities, without her finding out. In the days that followed, Tom sent me updates. He tracked her to that same hotel on several occasions, confirming my worst fears. He'd even managed to snap a few photos of her entering and leaving with the same man. They looked comfortable together, close. She seemed happier with him than I'd seen her in years. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut, but I steadied myself. I knew I had to stay calm and see this through. That evening, after Tom sent the final round of pictures, I sat alone in my office, staring at the evidence. There she was, laughing, holding his hand, looking at him with a warmth that had been missing from our life for years. It hurt. It hurt in a way that felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside out. But there was a part of me, a calm, calculating part, that was strangely at peace. I finally had what I needed. The next few days were a quiet whirlwind. I kept up my facade, coming home each night and pretending everything was normal, just waiting for the right moment. Laura seemed oblivious, lost in her new world, unaware that her lies were about to come crashing down. I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked right through me, as if I were a ghost in our home. I realized then that the woman I'd loved all these years was gone. Whatever part of her had once been mine was now somewhere else, with someone else. But I wasn't going to confront her in private. No, that would be far too easy. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to understand the depth of the betrayal she'd inflicted on our family. I wanted her to see the look in our children's eyes when they learned the truth. This wasn't just about me. It was about every memory, every family dinner, every Christmas morning we'd spent together, all tainted by her deceit. I started planning the confrontation for the next family dinner, a tradition we'd kept for as long as I could remember. Jake and Emily would be there, as usual, and I'd prepared everything to make sure there would be no running from the truth. I'd show her the photos, the phone records, every bit of proof I'd gathered over the past few weeks. And she would have to look each of us in the eye and admit to what she'd done. The night before the dinner, I barely slept. I lay awake, my mind racing, replaying every moment I'd spent with her, wondering if any of it had been real. Had she always been this way? Had I been blind to the truth all these years? Part of me felt like a fool, but another part felt a strange sense of relief. At least I would finally have the truth. At least I could start to rebuild whatever was left of my life. The day of the dinner arrived, and I could feel the tension in my chest, a tightness that wouldn't go away. I went through the motions, setting the table, preparing the house, forcing myself to smile and laugh with Jake and Emily as if nothing were wrong. But beneath the surface, my mind was a storm. When Laura walked through the door, she looked tired, maybe a little nervous, but I barely cared. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, but I held steady. Tonight, she was going to answer for everything. And so, we sat down for dinner, just like we had 100 times before, with the kids chatting about work and school, unaware of what was coming. I waited until we were halfway through the meal, letting the quiet, familiar rhythm lull everyone into a false sense of calm. And then, I reached into my pocket, pulling out the stack of evidence I'd been carrying for days. I placed it on the table, right in front of her. "Laura," I said, my voice low and steady, "I think there's something you need to explain to us." The room went silent. She stared at the papers, her face going pale as she realized what they were. Jake and Emily looked from her to me, confusion and fear flashing across their faces. She stammered, trying to find the words, but nothing came. I watched her, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction as the weight of her lies bore down on her. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, and I wasn't going to let her slip away from it. "Explain it," I repeated, my eyes fixed on hers. "Tell our children the truth." Laura's hands trembled as she reached for the stack of papers, her face drained of color. Jake and Emily sat frozen, their eyes darting between us, trying to process what was happening. I watched her closely, the calm exterior I'd kept up now fueled by a cold, unwavering determination. This was the moment she'd have to face what she'd done. To me, to us, to our family. She flipped through the photos slowly, each page seeming to chip away at her composure. I could see her fighting back tears, her gaze finally lifting to meet mine. But there was no sympathy left in me. For weeks, I'd waited, held back, and now every word I wanted to say was boiling to the surface. "Is this real, Mom?" Emily's voice was soft, barely a whisper, as she looked at her mother with a mix of shock and sadness that broke my heart all over again. Laura opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She glanced at the photos, then at me, searching for something, sympathy, a way out. But she found nothing. Her betrayal was laid bare, and there was no running from it now. Finally, she managed to speak, her voice shaky. "It's not what it looks like," she began, her eyes darting to the kids, then back to me. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it's not what you think. I never wanted to hurt any of you." I held up my hand, stopping her. "Enough. Don't insult us with excuses." I kept my tone controlled, though I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Look at Jake and Emily. Look at the family you've hurt. I want you to tell them the truth. The whole truth." Laura's gaze dropped to her lap, her hands clutching the edges of the photos as if they could somehow anchor her. Jake and Emily sat stiffly, waiting for her to speak, and I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that their innocence in all this was about to be shattered. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said at last, her voice breaking. "It had started innocently. I felt neglected. I thought you didn't care anymore, Michael." Her words felt hollow, rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. He was someone who listened to me, made me feel appreciated. I could feel Jake's anger rising beside me, his face flushed, his fists clenched. He looked at her with the kind of disappointment that only a mother could recognize. "You threw away Dad, all of us, for that," he said, his voice barely holding back the pain. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Jake. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought I could end it before anyone found out. I was wrong." She turned to me, desperation in her eyes. "Michael, please, it was just a mistake. I never stopped loving you. I just lost myself along the way." I stared at her, feeling the emptiness of her words. After everything she'd done, after all the secrets, the lies, the betrayal, she still wanted me to believe that somehow this was an accident. But I'd seen enough, heard enough. Whatever love she'd had for me was buried beneath those excuses. "No, Laura," I replied, my voice low but firm. "This wasn't just a mistake. It was choice after choice, lie after lie, and you never once stopped to think about what it would do to this family." She started to speak, to protest, but I raised a hand again. "Don't," I said. "I gave you the chance to tell the truth. I wanted you to admit it, to face what you've done. But now, there's nothing left to say." The room fell into silence. Jake and Emily looked at me, then at Laura, as the weight of what had happened settled over us. I could see the hurt in their eyes, the realization that the family they'd known was breaking apart. But for me, it was strangely liberating. All these weeks of hiding, of waiting, of keeping everything to myself had finally come to an end. I'd done what I came to do. I'd revealed the truth, and now she would have to live with it. Laura sat in silence, her tears streaming down her face as she watched us, realizing that this was no temporary rift. This was final. She tried reaching for my hand, but I pulled back, my mind made up. There would be no coming back from this. After a few moments, Jake pushed back his chair and left the table, his head down, not looking at her. Emily followed, but not before giving her mother a long, hard look, one that spoke more than any words could. They left us alone, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt nothing for her but a profound sense of loss. It was as if she'd become a stranger, someone I barely recognized. When Laura finally spoke again, her voice was small, desperate. "Michael, please, don't do this. Don't throw it all away." I looked at her, taking in the face of the woman I'd once trusted above all else. "You threw it away, Laura. You threw it away the first time you lied to me, to our kids, and there's no undoing that." She looked down, defeated, the gravity of her choices sinking in. There was nothing more to say. I stood up, walked out of the dining room, and left her sitting there in the silence of what remained. In the days that followed, Laura tried everything to fix things. She reached out to Jake and Emily, pleading with them to understand, but they'd seen the truth firsthand. They weren't willing to forgive her as easily as she'd hoped. She tried bringing up memories, reminding me of the good years we'd shared, the family vacations, the birthdays, the quiet nights we'd spent side by side. She suggested counseling, even tried arranging family dinners, hoping to rebuild what we'd lost. But it was too late. Each attempt only reminded me of the betrayal, the lies she'd spun to keep her secret. Each memory she tried to evoke felt tainted, twisted by the knowledge of what she'd done. I had nothing left to give her, no sympathy, no patience. One evening, she came into my office, where I'd taken to spending my nights. She placed a hand on my shoulder, as if that simple gesture could erase the distance between us. "Please, Michael," she whispered, "don't give up on us." I shook her hand off, looking her in the eye. "You gave up on us long before I knew the truth. There's nothing left here, Laura. Not for you and not for me." She broke down then, sobbing quietly as she left the room, and I felt a strange sense of finality, a weight lifting from my shoulders. For so long, I'd held on to the hope that somehow she'd understand the depth of what she'd done. But now I knew that I needed to move on, to rebuild a life without her. Our family, our memories, she'd broken them beyond repair. It wasn't long before I started the divorce process. I worked with my lawyer to secure my financial independence, setting boundaries that protected everything I'd worked for. Laura didn't protest much. She knew there was no point. Even Jake and Emily chose to stay with me, barely speaking to her despite her pleas for forgiveness. The day the divorce was finalized, I sat alone in my office, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd once thought was unbreakable. But I felt a sense of peace, a strange calm in knowing that I'd survived, that I'd faced her betrayal and come out stronger. Jake and Emily continued their lives, staying close to me, rebuilding in their own way. The dinners, the traditions, these things carried on, though now they felt different, quieter, marked by an absence that would never quite disappear. But we moved forward, finding new ways to keep our family intact, even without her. The months after the divorce were a strange, almost surreal time for me. I'd spent so many years revolving around the life Laura and I had built, only to find myself in an entirely different world, one where I was finally free of the betrayal and secrecy that had crept into my home. It was liberating, in a sense, but also lonely. I'd spent 24 years thinking that Laura and I were solid, that no matter what happened, we'd weather the storms together. But the reality was, she'd been slipping away from me for a long time. And now, I had to face a life without her. Jake and Emily stuck by me in ways I hadn't expected. They moved on from the initial shock and disappointment of discovering their mother's actions. But the closeness we shared felt stronger than ever. They'd been my anchor through it all, and I could see that they, too, were navigating the pain in their own ways. Sometimes, I'd catch a flash of anger in Jake's eyes when he'd mention Laura, or see a distant sadness on Emily's face when she'd hear her mother's name. I made it a point to keep up with the family routines, even though it wasn't quite the same. Every Sunday, we'd sit down for dinner, just the three of us. We'd laugh, talk, and try to pretend that things hadn't changed. And maybe they hadn't, not entirely. The love I had for my kids hadn't changed. If anything, it had deepened. Watching them handle everything with resilience and grace reminded me of the strength that still ran through our family. Laura had tried to reach out a few times after the divorce was finalized. At first, it was the same apologies I'd heard 100 times. She'd send messages, ask to meet for coffee, to explain or make things right. But I couldn't let her back in, not even to listen. I had no interest in rehashing the past or revisiting the pain. I needed to move forward, and the more I focused on building a new life, the more I realized that there was a peace in letting her go. One day, I received a letter from her. It was long, filled with memories and regrets, almost as if she was reliving the life we'd had together. She wrote about the first day we'd met, how she'd felt butterflies as she described it, and how she never thought she'd be capable of hurting me. She said she had fallen into something she couldn't control, that she had lost herself along the way and was desperate to turn back time. I sat with that letter for a long time. There was a part of me, I'll admit, that wanted to feel something reading her words. But I couldn't. Every apology, every word of regret, felt hollow now. The years we'd spent together, the laughter, the love, all of it had been undermined by her choices. And I knew that no letter could ever change that. I placed it in a drawer, closing it shut, as if to bury the chapter we'd shared. My life settled into a new rhythm, one marked by quiet independence. I found time for the things I'd once been too busy for. Long drives to clear my head, weekend trips with Jake and Emily, catching up on books that had sat unread on the shelf. I even began to find a sense of purpose in helping others who'd gone through similar betrayals. Friends of mine from work or around the neighborhood would come by, sharing their stories, their frustrations. I'd listen, offer advice where I could, and in those conversations, I began to feel a strange sense of purpose, like maybe this experience hadn't just torn my life apart. It had given me something to share with others. Jake and Emily eventually moved out to begin their own lives, though they stayed nearby. Watching them grow, seeing them find their own paths and relationships, was a source of pride I couldn't quite put into words. They would sometimes ask how I was doing, with that look in their eyes, the kind that told me they worried I might still be hurting. I'd assure them that I was okay, that I'd found my peace. And in a way, I'd learned to live with the scars Laura had left, to accept them as part of my past without letting them define my future. It was almost a year after the divorce when I heard the news about Laura. It came as a surprise, a phone call I hadn't expected on an otherwise ordinary day. A friend of ours, one we'd once vacationed with as a family, called to let me know that Laura had passed away suddenly. He didn't know many details, only that it had happened quietly, in her sleep. For a long time after I hung up, I sat in silence, letting the reality of her death settle over me. I didn't know what I felt. Part of me felt a pang of sorrow, not for the woman she'd become, but for the life we'd once shared. Another part of me felt closure, as if some door in my life had finally shut. I didn't feel anger or even sadness. It was just final. Whatever pain or resentment I had carried all these years seemed to dissolve in that moment, leaving only a quiet sense of peace. In the days that followed, I found myself going back through old memories, replaying scenes from our marriage, moments of laughter and companionship that felt like they belonged to another life. I found an old photograph of us, taken years ago on a beach vacation. We were smiling, arms around each other, eyes bright with a happiness that felt almost foreign to me now. I didn't know who that woman was anymore, and I suppose I didn't know who that man was either. I decided not to attend the funeral. Jake and Emily both went, paying their respects in their own way, but I knew that my goodbye had come long ago. I didn't need to stand by her grave to let go. In a way, I'd already done that, piece by piece, over the months after her betrayal. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset, I felt something unexpected, a sense of gratitude. Not for the betrayal, but for the resilience it had forced me to find. I'd learned what it meant to rebuild, to stand on my own. I'd learned the importance of trust and the strength that comes from facing life's deepest hurts with dignity. I didn't hate Laura anymore, and in that moment, I knew that whatever bitterness I'd felt was gone. Life continued, quiet but peaceful. Jake and Emily would visit often, bringing their own families as the years went by. Our family dinners continued, marked now by laughter, new stories, and the joy of knowing that we'd all weathered the storm together. The scars were there, but they were part of us, a reminder of what we'd overcome. In the end, Laura's betrayal hadn't broken me. It had changed me, yes, but in ways I'd come to accept. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting its warm glow over the world, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope. A hope for whatever lay ahead, for the life I'd yet to live, and for the peace I'd finally found after all that had come before. As the years passed, life settled into a quieter rhythm, and I could see how each of those years left its own mark. None, though, had shaped me as deeply as those days surrounding Laura's betrayal. That experience brought a strange kind of wisdom, a clarity I'd never expected but now carried with a certain pride. I'd learned that even the things we believe to be solid, the things we think we know, can change in an instant. And sometimes, the people we trust most are only strangers in disguise. The understanding I gained from that experience didn't come easily, but it brought me a peace I hadn't anticipated. In the months after the divorce, I slowly found myself feeling freer, almost lighter. I'd never have guessed that a quieter, more solitary life could be so fulfilling, but I was beginning to appreciate the stillness. I spent time fishing by the river, sitting with my thoughts as the water drifted past. Sundays were spent cooking for Jake and Emily, keeping our family dinners going in a new, simpler form. Evenings were my own, spent with a book in hand, the gentle sound of the wind outside. I realized that, in some ways, life had given me a second chance to enjoy what really mattered. I just had to be open to it. Jake and Emily continued to thrive. Watching them find their paths, I saw that everything we'd gone through together had strengthened them. From time to time, they'd tell me how proud they were of me, and although it meant a great deal, I couldn't help feeling they gave me too much credit. In truth, I'd endured it for them as much as for myself. I wanted to show them that strength could emerge from hardship and that, no matter how hard life tried to knock you down, you could stand again. Seeing them so steady, building lives of their own, was a comfort I held close. Sometimes they'd ask if I'd thought about dating again, laughing as they tried to play matchmaker. I'd laugh with them, partly to deflect the question, but partly because I was happy in a way I hadn't expected. There was no hole left in my life, no empty place I needed to fill. After Laura, I'd learned to feel whole on my own. I wouldn't turn away from companionship if it came, but I'd come to understand that contentment didn't need anything more than what I already had. It was enough. One day, out of the blue, a letter arrived. It was from an old friend who'd known Laura and me in the early years of our marriage. She'd written to share a memory she'd cherished, a simple evening spent in our home. She wrote about Laura, how warm she'd been, and how happy she had seemed back then. She mentioned how she'd envied the closeness we'd had, or at least the closeness she thought we had. Reading that letter brought a wave of memories from those early years, transporting me to a time when we were younger, untouched by life's challenges. It was like catching a glimpse of a different person, a version of myself I'd left behind long ago. But to my surprise, as I read on, I didn't feel regret for those years I'd spent with Laura. I felt a strange gratitude. They had, after all, become part of me, woven into the story of who I was, inseparable from the person I'd become. As I sat there with the letter in my hand, I whispered a quiet thank you to that memory of Laura. For all the hurt, the lies, and the disappointment, I knew I wouldn't be the man I was now if it weren't for what I'd gone through. She taught me things about myself I might never have realized. I knew now that I was stronger than I'd thought, that I could forgive deeply, and that, despite everything, I had the capacity to move forward with dignity. Time continued on, and I watched as Jake and Emily found love and grew into lives of their own. Both of them married, starting families, and as I became a grandfather, I found myself with a new role I hadn't expected to enjoy so much. Those little ones looking up at me with wide, curious eyes filled me with a sense of gratitude I hadn't felt in years. This, I realized, was my legacy, love, strength, and resilience passed down to them. I knew they would carry it forward, shaping lives full of integrity and kindness. On quiet mornings, I'd sit out on the porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise and reflecting on all the twists and turns life had brought my way. I found that I no longer had any regrets. Life hadn't gone as I'd planned, but I understood now that it had turned out exactly as it needed to. Each chapter, each hardship, had taught me something invaluable, and I was grateful for the hard-won wisdom it had given me. Sometimes, in those early hours, Laura's memory would drift in, soft and distant, like the dawn light itself. But I felt no bitterness, only a faint echo of what we'd once shared. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I didn't linger on what could have been. Instead, I found acceptance. Forgiveness had come slowly, not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd let go. I had moved forward, free from bitterness, with my head high and my heart lighter than it had been in years. And with each day, I found new reasons to be thankful, not only for my family, but for the resilience that had carried me through it all. Life has a way of testing us, of pushing us to the edge of what we think we can handle. But in those dark moments, I'd learned that we find strength we didn't know we had. I'd learned that the hard way, but that strength was mine to keep. For me, peace didn't mean forgetting the past, but embracing it, letting it shape me without letting it control me. Each morning, as I looked out toward the horizon, I felt ready for whatever might come, whether it was the joy of family, the quiet pleasures of solitude, or maybe, one day, even the companionship of someone new. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined, but it was one I had come to cherish. Life had shown me its scars, but I'd learned to wear them as badges of honor. And each sunrise brought with it a renewed sense of purpose, a readiness for the days still waiting to unfold. I had faced life's trials, and I'd come out stronger. As I sat there, watching dawn break over a world filled with new beginnings, I knew, without a doubt, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The years that followed were quieter, but, in many ways, more meaningful. Without Laura, I found myself growing into a life I hadn't expected. It was a simpler existence, one free from the weight of betrayal, and yet filled with small, profound moments that gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I'd sit out on the porch in the mornings, coffee in hand, and watch the sun rise over the quiet landscape. There was something comforting in the stillness, a peace I hadn't felt in years. Life had taken me on a path I hadn't planned, but somehow, I felt like I'd ended up exactly where I was supposed to be. I was content, not because I'd forgotten what had happened, but because I'd learned to accept it, to see it as part of my story and move forward. Jake and Emily remained close, visiting often, bringing their families for the Sunday dinners we'd preserved. They'd both managed to build solid, happy lives, which gave me more pride than I could ever express. Seeing them grow, watching them find love and purpose, reminded me that no matter what I'd lost, I still had what mattered most. I had family, love, and a deep-seated resilience I wouldn't trade for anything. Sometimes, I'd feel Laura's memory drift into my thoughts, like an old, faded photograph in the back of my mind. She wasn't someone I dwelled on anymore, though. Her memory had softened, the bitterness washed away over time. If anything, I felt a quiet acceptance. She'd been part of my life for decades, and in the end, I'd come to terms with what that meant, good and bad. What surprised me most was how I'd come to forgive her. Not in the sense that I'd forget, but in a way that allowed me to let go of the hurt, to see her as a chapter that had simply come to its end. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was one that had given me back a part of myself. I no longer felt weighed down by resentment or regret. Instead, I felt lighter, ready for whatever the future held. Jake and Emily would sometimes ask if I'd ever consider meeting someone new. I'd laugh, brushing it off, but the idea didn't seem impossible anymore. There was something reassuring about being open to new possibilities, to know that I could move forward with a heart that was once again at peace. One evening, after a long day, I found myself looking through some old family photos. There we were, all of us smiling at the beach, arms around each other, Laura and I looking younger and happier than I could remember. I stared at the photo for a moment, feeling an unexpected wave of gratitude. Not for Laura herself, but for the life I'd managed to build afterward, for the strength I'd discovered within myself. That strength was my legacy, something I'd passed down to Jake and Emily, something I hoped would carry them through life's storms as it had carried me. As I closed the photo album, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. I'd weathered the worst, rebuilt my life, and even learned to cherish the memories without letting them define me. Life had shown me its harsher sides, but it had also shown me the joy of resilience, of family, of moving forward without bitterness. The next morning, as I watched the sun rise, I felt a readiness for whatever lay ahead. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I'd come to love it just as it was. With a calm heart, I greeted the new day, grateful for all that I had and for the journey that had made me who I was. As I look back over the years, I realized just how far I'd come. Life after Laura's betrayal had forced me to rebuild, to examine who I was without the person I'd once thought would be by my side forever. At first, it had been a lonely road, filled with confusion and pain, but as time passed, I found myself again, stronger, wiser, and most surprisingly, more at peace than I had ever been. Jake and Emily remained the center of my world. Watching them grow and thrive, building their own lives with resilience and kindness, was a constant reminder of the legacy I hoped to leave. They carried within them the lessons I tried to impart, the value of integrity, the strength of forgiveness, and the courage to move forward no matter what life throws at you. I was proud of the people they'd become, and that pride filled the once empty spaces that Laura's betrayal had left. I found comfort in small, everyday joys. A cup of coffee in the morning, the sun rising over the trees, the laughter of my grandchildren when they visited. Life was quiet, yes, but it was a quiet I'd come to love. I'd learned that peace didn't have to mean forgetting or erasing the past. Instead, peace was about finding a way to live with those memories, to hold on to what was good and let go of what was painful. Sometimes I'd still feel Laura's memory drift in, though now it was like a faint echo, a chapter in my life that had come and gone. I felt no bitterness, no resentment. I had forgiven her, not because she'd asked for it, but because I needed to free myself. That forgiveness was a gift I'd given to myself, allowing me to truly move forward. One evening, after a family gathering, I sat alone on the porch, watching the stars. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and most of all for the resilience I'd found within myself. Life had tested me, yes, but it had also shown me my own strength. And I'd come to realize that strength was something no one could take from me. As I sat there, I thought about the years ahead. I didn't know what they would hold, but I felt ready for them. Whether they were filled with family, friendships, or perhaps even new love, I knew that I would meet them with a heart that was open and unburdened. The past no longer held me. I was free. In the end, I had learned that life isn't always what we plan, but sometimes it brings us exactly where we need to be. I had come through the storm, and now, in the quiet peace of the present, I found myself right where I was meant to be.